This is a Film Stories original podcast. We made this.
Everybody to the X-Cast. I'm your host this week, Carl Sweeney, and by now hopefully you will have heard our main episode on Paper Hearts, the fabulous season 4 episode, but we think there's more to be said about this episode, so joining me for this kind of supplemental follow-up episode, the kind of deep background on Paper Hearts, is Chris Knowles. Hey Chris.
Carl, always good to be with you.
Yeah, always a real pleasure, and especially when we're discussing, well, I mean, what I think is a great episode. I assume you feel the same way.
Oh, this is as good as it gets. This is as good as anything gets. I mean, television, beer, sex, puppies. I mean, this is as good as anything gets of any type. So, I mean, sometimes when I watch this, I just can't believe what I'm seeing. It's so intense. And the thing with this episode in particular is just how committed both David and Gillian are to their performances here. I mean, just absolutely superlative in every single way.
Yeah, I feel like you and I spend quite a bit of time singing David Duchovny's praises, but you're absolutely right, of course. And Gillian Anderson's great too. And yeah, it's just that real emotional effect, isn't it, that this one kind of conjures up?
Well, I'll tell you something. This is a very interesting season or series, as you Brits like to call it.
Yeah.
This was running concurrently with Millennium. And I think that Chris Carter and the staff's interactions with the Academy group had a real effect on their writing and on the mood of the show. I mean, Glenn Morgan had talked about how, everyone talks about how the X-Files influenced Millennium, but nobody talks about how the Millennium influenced the X-Files, particularly in this season. And I think Vince Gilligan was particularly affected by this because, he gave us Unruly and Paper Hearts, which are really as dark as dark gets, very grim, very intense. I mean, Unruly, I think, is very flawed as an episode. There are a lot of things I do like about it, and a lot of things I like about how David and Gillian perform in Vince's episodes, in particular this season. And some of the attitude that Vince provides for David is phenomenal. Particularly in this episode as well. The confrontation in the summer house. So I think that there were a lot of things going on, and I think that one of the things that fans should really look into to deepen their appreciation of the X-Files is subtext, and how much is unsaid and implied, or how much is unsaid but inserted into the storylines. And this is a classic example of how much of what was going on and how much the research, particularly. I mean, obviously, I think the Academy group had a huge influence on this episode in particular, and casting choices. Tom Noonan, terrific actor.
Yeah.
A lot of people might remember him from Manhunter, which was the first adaptation of the Hannibal Lecter mythos, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think he was particularly well cast as Francis Dollarhide, but his performance was very good, for what it was. And he was also in RoboCop 2. He played, particularly evil villain in that movie, and he's played villains in a lot of movies, and he's very good. And we can talk about some of the insights that he and Vince sort of shared in the construction of this character, because it was very much a collaborative process. And Noonan had some very interesting sort of ideas about how he was going to portray this character, and I think it's you see it. You don't see it in the text, but you definitely see it in the subtext. So,
right. So in terms of the subtext, so what I was going to ask you is, obviously we did that episode last year on Oubliette and the kind of mythological underpinnings of that episode. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm thinking is, do you see this one in the same sort of light? And if so, how does Vince Gilligan kind of factor into that? Because I'd always wondered if Carter was the one with all these esoteric interests. But are you saying that Vince Gilligan, you think, shared them, or what?
It's very interesting because Vince had originally pitched this episode as, essentially a mythology episode. And his take was like, let's do a mythology episode, about Samantha, but let's not do it, where she was, abducted by aliens. Let's leave open this question if maybe he had a more mundane explanation. And I think that there's a kind of a through line from the first season up to the, at least the seventh season, possibly the eighth. I think that you can sort of include Invocation in this line here. And it starts with Conduit. And it's sort of how the, these mythologies that we talked about from the ancient world sort of inform this very profound and intimate drama in the X-Files. And Conduit, just a terribly underrated episode in my estimation, really sort of speaks to that and speaks to this whole lost child narrative, with Demeter and Persephone that we've talked about in the past. And that was very much a foundational myth of the ancient world, particularly how it pertained to, agriculture and growing seasons and so on and so forth. I believe personally, and this is purely speculation on my part, I don't have documentary evidence for this per se, but I believe that Vince was very, very touched and influenced by Oubliette. And I think that there's sort of very subtle callbacks to Oubliette in this episode. And I think that some of the unanswered questions, both in Oubliette and this episode, are sort of addressed in Sign and Sight and Closure. So I sort of see them as a set, sort of a mini-series within the series. And I think that the issues, with the... And it's interesting, too, because this is something I kind of... I don't know if I sensed, but I just felt like very strongly when I first watched Sign and Sight. I'm like, oh, this is sort of a sequel to Paper Hearts and, by extension to Oubliette. Because, it sort of made sense to me that, like, it's never really fully explained how Mulder and Roach have this, psychic connection. But, I think it might have been facilitated by these walk-ins, these sort of interdimensional disembodied aliens that sort of weave in and out of the series. And I think that is very much, sort of the underpinning here. And I guess if you really wanted to get fancy about it, you could say, well, in the first season we have Conduit, in the second season we have Red Museum, in the third season we have Oubliette, and it's sort of like this, and then of course Paper Hearts, so it's sort of like this quadrinity, this what is that? Would be a tectarch or something. I'm not exactly sure of the, not a triptych, but a 4-part triptych. Tectarch, I think it's pronounced. Anyway, I think that they're all part of a whole, and I very much believe that there was an understanding within the writers' room that these episodes were all of a piece, and we're all exploring this through line. Because like I said, I mean, one of the weaknesses about this episode, probably the only weakness, and it's a purely subjective estimation, is that it's never really explained how they have this psychic link. So I think that Gilligan bunts a bit on that. But if you place it in the context of these other episodes, and then in the whole context of this walk-in mythology, I think that it all coheres and congeals and holds together very well.
Yeah, so that exchange about the psychic nexus, it seems like, Duchovny sells that really well, so you kind of go along with it in the moment, but I see what you're saying. Right, so you mentioned subtle callbacks to Oubliette, so what are you thinking of? Are you thinking of things like, we have another red light here, don't we? Like we had Carl Wade shined a red light, didn't he, in Oubliette, and here we have the thing that appears in the dream imagery, or are you thinking of other things?
I think that in particular, but also the car, and just also the the girls, the young girls being stalked. I think that there's a lot of subtle And I think there was a conscious effort on Gilligan's part. Again, this is, speculation on my part, but I do believe that there was a conscious effort on his part to not consciously make it seem like this was a sequel, that this was an episode, a standalone. It stood alone. But I think that those themes were really very powerful in his mind. But also the psychic link. I mean, the psychic link between Amy. This is almost the counterpart, because the psychic link between Amy and Lucy Householder is, finds its counterpart in the psychic link between Mulder and the killer. So I think that the two very much have a counterpart aspect to it. But also, Mulder in Oubliette's his sort of his confrontation with the mother of the kidnapped girl, and then here, that's sort of played out. But also the tension between Mulder and his emotional investment in these cases and the FBI. So don't forget that we have, Mulder is sort of clashing with that ASAC in Oubliette, and then that same conflict is carried out into this episode with Mulder and Skinner. So I think that there are definite through lines there. There are definite that Mulder is going out on a limb for these cases because he feels such a profound personal connection to them, and that brings him into conflict with his superiors.
Yeah, well, there's a line, isn't there, said to Mulder by Roach, that it's like your world will be okay as long as you believe in flying saucers. And like you've spoken about that before, haven't you? That you see, the Samantha storyline kind of played out on a different plane or something in these episodes like Oubliette that deal with abducted women or whatever it may be.
Yeah, and if you really want to get fancy, I mean, you could make an argument, particularly in the context of I Want to Believe, that this whole alien abduction thing was all just compensation all along. You know what I mean? That the sister was abducted, in this case by the military for use in these eugenics tests, and that Mulder couldn't handle that, and he also couldn't handle his parents' complicity, which he comes to realize starting, I guess, with Paperclip, that he had to construct this sort of tableau, this narrative about the aliens, because he couldn't come to grips with the fact that, this was done with the complicity of his parents, and it was done by the military, and it was done, it was not something mysterious. It was something that happened, by people that he knew. It was a betrayal, really. I mean, he couldn't countenance the betrayal that was really implied by all this. And I think in some regards that even the Watkins, it's the thing I love about Sign and Sight and Closure is that it's really, if you really get into the whole concept of POV storytelling, it could all just be entirely a fantasy or even a hallucination on the part of these people who are really victims of these crimes, and victims by, not directly, but victims, in that their loved ones were taken from them. So that this whole Watkins narrative and explanation could just be just complete fantasy. And then maybe when we get to I Want to Believe, which is another ridiculously underrated and misunderstood film or story, that it's just like your sister's dead, isn't she? What the psychic says. The psychic understands, like, it wasn't E.T., it's like she's dead, and Mulder's just kind of like, yeah, well, whatever. Yeah. So I think even in that regard, I mean, I think that this narrative, particularly starting with Oubliette and these psychic connections, and in Paper Hearts, carries over all the way up to, I Want to Believe, which is all about these psychic connections between, victims and victimizers and that kind of thing. So,
yeah. So what do you make of that scene in Paper Hearts? I love it. It's where Mulder finds himself back in the Samantha abduction scene, and I think the way Duchovny plays it, he's so haunted, and it's just this kind of, I don't know, I guess Freudians would call it the uncanny or something, where it's so strangely familiar, and he's kind of playing on that as the scene goes on. But yeah, very powerful stuff.
Now, which scene in particular? The flashback scenes?
The scene where he's there as an adult, but it's Samantha on the floor playing Stratego or whatever it is.
Well, that's an interesting thing, because if you look at dream analysis, people don't picture themselves as children in their dreams, that even if they hark back to memories and whatnot, they always see themselves as they are. So I think that's very true and very real, that he's experiencing as an adult and not as a child. And I think also that there's a very, compelling explanation for what on the surface and what in reality might be a narrative, continuity error, that we hear these different stories about, in Conduit, in The Pilot, in Little Green Men, and I guess even by extension in this episode, that, the narrative of this abduction keeps shifting. But I think the clear implication is that there's somehow some sort of, like what Mulder says, there's some sort of nexus that Roach and Mulder become linked. Now, Tom Noonan, I just want to get into this because I think this is really important, is that, so this is what Tom Noonan had to say. He said, Mulder was Roach's soulmate, a guy he felt he could really connect with. And then he continues on. He says, when he'd say something about Samantha or his other victims and Mulder would get upset, Roach would think, what are you so upset about? This is our life together. It's like, so Mulder has, Roach has this sort of attitude that he and Mulder are linked, throughout their lives because of their connection, that Mulder, arrested him. And I think this is a very common thing. And this is something, we see, for instance, in Pusher, that Modell sort of sees himself and Mulder as, as soulmates, as counterparts, and it's almost like Holmes and Moriarty or something, this love-hate relationship. And it's very interesting that Roach brought that to this, but one of the things that I have to say, and it's sort of in the context of me sort of questioning like that there might be a meta-narrative beneath the entire series as a whole, is that if you looked at Mulder, right, even like he's regarded as being ridiculous by everyone else in the FBI and stuff, if that was a real agent, he would be like a god. like people would be like bowing before him as he walked down the hall, because look at how many serial killers he's busted. Can you name another real life profiler? It's like he leaves violent crimes because he doesn't want to deal with serial killers anymore, and he ends up busting more serial killers than anyone in human history. You know what I'm saying? Roach is a great example. In Sign and Sight, Ed Trulove, and it just goes on and on and on throughout the series. That he's arresting serial murders or cracking these cases. There's no way that he wouldn't be like, an assistant director by the third season. You know what I mean? He would be seen as like such a rock star, and it's very interesting that the sort of narrative stasis that the Carter and the writers felt the series had to exist in doesn't sort of like acknowledge the fact that there's just no way in hell that this guy would not be seen as like the greatest criminal profiler that ever walked the face of the planet. You know what I'm saying? Just look at all these serial cases that he cracks, all these unsolved cases that he cracks. And this is a great example. Just the fact that he was able to, Karen Ann Filipponti and the other girl, that he was able to solve their murders. This is like, this is a rock star. This is not a guy down in the basement. There's just no reality to that at all,
I suppose the other side is that wouldn't he have been in some pretty serious trouble in this episode, though, for, letting Roach out of his sight kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. If he was like the agent that he's depicted as, he would just be out on his ear. That would be the end of it. But if he was a rock star, if he was this rock star, case cracker, they'd be like, oh, well, whatever it takes. You got him in the end, so that's all that matters. You know what I'm saying? It would be that kind of deal. So to me, it's very funny. The disconnect between, what Mulder accomplishes in the real world and the way he's portrayed in the series, it just doesn't make any sense. Like somebody like Kirsch, if I don't know where Kirsch would be in the chain of command over him, but even in the 6th season when he's just like, he's giving him all this grunt work to do, he's still cracking these huge cases. So it's just, it's kind of absurd. But anyway, that's television for you. That's why it's a science fiction program and not, a docudrama.
Yeah, well, and certainly like television at this time as well. I know I've seen a quote from Vince Gilligan where he talked about, how in Redux they have Mulder kill the guy in his apartment, and it's kind of brushed under quite quickly. It's never referred to again, and all this kind of stuff.
Well, I just want to answer that because that's a very interesting point. Because I think Gilligan is mistaken in there, because the guy who was spying on him was a spy, and he was involved in sort of covert military stuff. When guys like that get killed, they don't tend to address it. They tend to brush it under the carpet because they don't want people starting to pull on these threads that are going to lead, from this guy's death to other places. But, that's neither here nor there. But that, I think he's an error in that estimation there.
In that specific example. Right, let me ask you about some of these visual symbols or emblems that pop up in this episode, and which of them, if any, you think have kind of a broader, like, symbological meaning or whatever. So, we see in the teaser, don't we? We see that it's quite a brief image, but quite a haunting one of the girl kind of descending into the ground. Just dream images generally, but also things like cloth hearts. The number 13 is referred to. Is there anything going on with any of these elements that you think is significant?
Oh, quite a bit, yeah. Because the girl being pulled down into the underworld, again, is that classic Persephone mythology that really undergirds the entire franchise. But I also think that, in that context, we sort of can see Roach and Mulder as like Antichrist and Christ. They have this sort of savior, anti-savior relationship. And, Hades was always, an important part of the story is that Hades comes up to the earth from the underworld in his chariot and takes Persephone down to hell in his chariot. So I think that's very important because, in this case, Roach is so closely identified with his car, right? His with the camper shell, the El Camino. And I don't know if this is intentional on Gilligan's part, but El Camino in Spanish means the way, and the way is, a very common epithet in Christianity to refer to Jesus Christ. So it's like, he's the Antichrist, and in that connection. And I'm sure that Carter briefed all his writers on this whole Persephone, Hades kind of narrative, meta-narrative, because we see it repeated, so much, throughout the series. So I think that in that regard, I think that again, this is another callback. I think that, it was understood, because of the whole river Styx in the end of Oubliette and all that kind of thing, that this was drawing on this mythology. This is drawing on this Greek mythology. And I think that in the use of the car, the chariot, and, the way, this kind of intimate, thesis, antithesis relationship that Roach and Mulder have, I think that Gilligan is very consciously processing the same symbolism that, that will repeat, again in Sign and Sight and Closure, and arguably, even though it's gender swapped in Invocation. Invocation to me, I think, is another episode that isn't really necessarily understood. And it also has the whole thing with the, the car, or the chariot, in the killer's truck that carries the horses and so on and so forth. And, horses, chariot, you see what I'm saying? It's like, it's clear that there's a conscious processing of this symbolism throughout the series. And I definitely believe very strongly that Gilligan was read in on this kind of understanding, this mythological understanding.
And just like maybe more broadly, but he was very attentive, wasn't he, to things like continuity in a way that perhaps some of the other writers weren't. So we get the quote here, which is lifted from, I think it's Aubrey, don't we? I think there's a reference to Reggie Perdue as well. So
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, Gilligan had said that he was a fan first and a writer second. So in other words, he was an X-Files fan first and foremost. So he sort of has this like fanfic attention to, details from previous issues. So he has, you mentioned Reggie Perdue and then his time in Violent Crimes, the Little Green Men abduction sort of replayed, the ankle holster that we saw in Nisei, right? That we first saw in Nisei. And, Mrs. Mulder's stroke, and then of course that line about the dreams. So I definitely think that there's a a conscious attempt to pull in broader strokes of the mythology into what most people don't necessarily see as a mythology episode, but I certainly do. I certainly see this as a mythology episode, and and Reggie of course would show up again, in name only, in Unusual Suspects, and also in Forehead Sweat. So it's interesting too. It's interesting that Gilligan has that kind of attention to detail. I also think in some cases that I think that there Unruhi is an episode that we really need to see in context of this, because that's definitely a pair. I think Unruhi and Paper Hearts are definitely a pair, because you have the same sort of psychic serial killer elements. You have the same elements with the car, the chariot, the Hades, the abducted. Well, in Rui's case, they're women, and then of course Scully sort of plays that part. And to me, that is, I guess, sort of the not the downfall, but I think sort of like the weakest points of Unruhi is going to the whole Scully abduction well again. Yeah. I don't think it really served the story. I think that they should have introduced a female character who they had. Like who would have been a good character being abducted in Unruhi is Holly, the secretary. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like somebody who they had some sort of connection to. Yeah. Yeah, they had some sort of connection to, but didn't have like a more explicit connection. Just the fact that it's Scully again. It's like, how many times do we have to see this? This is getting a little tired. And it's a shame too, because I think otherwise it's a really fantastic episode. Particularly the and this is another connection that I want to make here is the Mulder and Scully's attitude when they're interviewing the Pruitt Taylor Vince character, and Mulder's attitude, like that Mulder is very like Scully is pissed off and super skeptical. And Mulder is very taunting, you know what I mean? When he's sort of like, you left that for me like a fingerprint, you know what I mean? It's just like, you idiot, you know what I mean? You don't even know what you're doing. So I think that, and in this case, in Paper Hearts, I mean, I just get chills when I think of like, there's this one look that Scully shoots Roach, and it's just, I don't know how she did this, but it's just like, it just burns with this unbelievable intensity, just this pure hatred of this man, and it's really astonishing. And I think that that attitude that we see in Unruhi, that when Mulder's he's almost cocky, it's a cocky sort of taunting, it's more cop-like than we're used to from Mulder. And then when we see Wrong House, like this, like where he just sort of like just shreds Roach's whole, song and dance routine. He's just like, you were never here, you liar. You know what I mean? I think David is absolutely terrific in that. And I think we talk about how great David is because we usually end up talking about episodes where he is really great. And so I think that's the case. And he's just absolutely terrific in this. And as everybody, all around just salutary performances. I would say.
Right. What do you make of the use of like Alice in Wonderland then in this story? Because I think there's some interesting things to get into there with like Lewis Carroll, and I just want to preface this by saying that like the Victorian era was kind of a different time, and some of Lewis Carroll's biographers disagree on certain aspects of him, but he was a figure who was a subject of some controversy in regards to his kind of sexual interests and behaviour. Now, I'm not sure how much, if at all, that was on the minds of people like Vince Gilligan at this time, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. What do you think?
Oh, I think it's fascinating, and I think it's very important. Particularly, that whole riff there. I don't think it's. I don't think he just said, "Well, what can I do for sort of a cool fairy tale kind of motif here to incorporate in the story?" No, I think it was much more conscious and much more deliberate, and I think it has to do. One thing that should be known about the X-Files writing staff is that they were spending a lot of time researching conspiracy theory, researching stuff on the internet, researching the sort of conspiracy underground. I mean, Chris Carter, talks about this quite openly in a lot of interviews. Particularly one of the interviews I'm thinking of is one of the interviews he gave to Rolling Stone. I mean, he was very open about this, and all of the books he was reading. And Alice in Wonderland is very important, not only because of this whole connection with Lewis Carroll, but also its connection to MK Ultra and mind control, fact and lore. A couple things that need to be known here is that so MK Ultra originally starts off as an interrogation program, and it has a couple predecessors like Artichoke and Bluebird, and when so the impetus behind this was interrogation of spies. This was a huge concern, particularly in Germany, because you had the division of Germany, you had the Berlin Wall, I mean, all this kind of stuff, Eastern Europe. So there was a lot of concern in their Cold War context about, ferreting out spies, interrogating spies. Spies were very well trained in resisting torture and resisting interrogation techniques. So one of the early interrogation techniques that was being developed in what later became these mind control programs, and that's a very broad term, but it's called the Alice in Wonderland technique. And the Alice in Wonderland technique is to bombard a subject with absurdity and to ask him absurd questions and to just, create this, like this sort of wonderland where the person being interrogated doesn't understand what's going on, doesn't understand what anybody wants, and is thrown into such a state of confusion that it begins to wear down his resistance, to the interrogation. And it was, explicitly known. I mean, there's paperwork in the National Archives about this, that it was called the Alice in Wonderland technique. So how does this apply to Paper Hearts? Well, I mean, what do we see in Paper Hearts? We see interrogations, right? Mm-hmm. But the ironic thing is, and this I think is a very important point, is that Roach is sort of flipping the script on Mulder, that he's playing this whole Alice in Wonderland, fantasy world. What if this is this? And, he's sort of reversing that equation on Mulder. So in other words, he's doing the interrogation of Mulder. And I think that, you can very clearly see the anger that we see when they eventually end up on Martha's Vineyard is Mulder's sort of resentment that he was outplayed. Mulder was definitely outplayed by Roach throughout the episode. To the very end. It's almost like Mulder kills him when he didn't necessarily have to, because he's just, it's that Mulder's anger, about being outplayed. Because I definitely think Roach obviously outplays him because he gets away and kidnaps this girl and so on and so forth. So I think that's very important, because I'm sure that this was being discussed in the writer's room. But also, there's a lot of apocryphal and a lot of misinformation about, Alice in Wonderland techniques being used in some of these mind control programs. And there's this sort of quasi-mythical program called Marnik, in which Alice in Wonderland symbolism was being used. You've seen Alice in Wonderland motifs being used in a lot of fiction, dealing with these kinds of, particularly there was an episode of Fringe that I think, sort of applies in this regard. So they were definitely, researching this material. And I think that because of the resonance of this Alice in Wonderland motif in a lot of this literature, both factual and fictional, I think that was why that Vince Gilligan, really hit on that, because it has so many layers of impact. It has the layers of impact where, it applies to this whole narrative with mind control programs, but it's like childhood innocence being defiled, and then like all these things that we know about Lewis Carroll, and basically, whatever you can say about Lewis Carroll, he's essentially a child pornographer, because he's taking nude photos of this girl Alice Liddell that he was obsessed with, and so on and so forth. So I think that there's a lot of undercurrent here and a lot of subtext that I think, even if people are not consciously processing it, it informs the narrative, and it gives it just so much more power and effect.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing with the X-Files, of course, was that you can go from an episode like Paper Hearts 1 week to... Well, it wouldn't have been the week after, because Paper Hearts was actually the Christmas episode that year, I think.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Yeah.
Dead children. I mean, that's another thing, like, showing that episode for your Christmas special. I mean, that's pretty grim, I mean, again, it's that innocent childhood defiled. I mean, I don't know if that was consciously scheduled to do so, but that certainly has that effect, yeah. Because it's not even in the sequence. It was played out of sequence. So I mean, was that intentional?
Yeah.
I don't know. So yeah.
And even before we move on, but like Mark Snow's music in this episode is interesting, isn't it? 'Cause it's got that kind of lightness of tone in certainly the early sequences. That kind of seems incongruous if you look at it on the face of it and you think it's all this massively bleak subject matter. But
yeah, he said he was influenced by Mendelssohn. Particularly the the score for Midsummer's Night Dream, and I think that's a very interesting connotation there too as well, because it's Midsummer's Night Dream is sort of like fairyland, it's Wonderland, it's almost like a precursor to all that.
All right, so yeah, what I was going to say was Paper Hearts, and then the very next episode is El Mundo Guerra, and I know you and you get this through the series, don't you? You go from like Pusher to Tessa Dos Bichos and things like that, but. You said that El Mundo Guerra, something in that's kind of you've seen in a different light recently. So yeah, seeing as we're here, what is that? What have you noticed in El Mundo Guerra?
I'm glad you brought that up, because it suddenly struck me watching El Mundo Guerra. I was cleaning out my crawl space and I had that disc playing, the DVD playing, and let's face facts. El Mundo Guerra is a pretty awful episode. I mean, I think Ruben Blades is very good in that episode as the INS agent, but it's otherwise, pretty grim. And it makes me wonder, because, the slot that El Mundo Guerra is in, it's sort of like early January when they knew that, this is ironic because they anticipated that people would not be watching, but ironically, 6 million people more watched El Mundo Guerra than Paper Hearts, which is just like, how did that happen?
No
What time space warp, caused that to happen? But anyway, I think that these episodes, John Scheiben, I think he had sort of a long learning curve as a writer. I mean, I think that I think Chris did a lot of rewriting of his work, his early work. I think that if you really watch The Walk, that there's a lot of, you hear a lot of Chris's voice in that. So I think there was a lot of rewriting. I think that, there's a lot of rewriting done of that. And I think with Tessa Dos Bichos, I mean, I know for a fact that, John Scheiben had wanted to, instead of the Killer Cats, to have a Jaguar. And that would have just been like, really? Come on, it's like a Jaguar running around Boston. That's not, that's cheeseball. So I think that, this is something I've discussed with Darren is, Chris's sort of fallback position is to go back to the psychedelic hallucinogenic well, because, a great example of this is Excelsior's DA, which takes place in the nursing home. So I think that, in the case of El Mundo Guerra, I think it was just a really bad script. No offense to John, because I think he wrote some great episodes as well. But, he was still pretty green at that point in time. And I think it needed a lot of rewriting. And I think that, Chris, the whole thing with the Yahoo and the psychedelics and all that kind of thing. And that just seems to be like, classic Chris Carter. And with El Mundo Guerra, it's really interesting because, it's tackling sort of the Chupacabra mythology or, however you choose to frame it. But it's also like the Chupacabra is a fungus. It's a fungus from space, basically. So I sense the looming figure of Chris Carter over that script as well. And in this regard, when I went back and I looked sort of the sequencing of the entire series, one thing I've always pointed out is that the Alien episodes are often followed by episodes about hallucinogenic drugs, either followed or preceded. So, but it's, they're twinned, a great case of this is Field Trip, with the mushroom and the hallucination and all that kind of thing, and then biogenesis. So I'm really starting to wonder, what is Chris Carter trying to say? Because if there's one thing we can point to the executive producer as doing is scheduling the episodes. I mean, that's one of their jobs. So, if you look throughout the series, you'll see this motif occur. But then I sort of, and I don't even know how I figured this out. I don't know why I sort of got on this, but this whole thing with El Mundo Gira, and the Chupacabra is this fungus from space and the purple lightning and all this kind of stuff. I was just like, well, what if, how does this tie into, this whole MK Ultra thing? Because I was also thinking about Paper Hearts, because I was sort of mentally preparing for this discussion. And I'm starting to put all these things together, and I'm just like, well, what if you go through the entire series and you see all these episodes about aliens and the mythology and so on and so forth, they're always twinned or paired, or however you want to put a sequence somehow, with episodes either about hallucinogenic drugs, hallucinations in general, or mind control. So, a great example of this would be Piper Maru and Apocrypha, where we first see the black oil. What's the very next episode? The very next episode is Pusher, which is about somebody who has, mind control powers. And I mean, and then I'm looking throughout the entire series, and this goes back to the first. So we talked about biogenesis and Field Trip. So you have the hallucinogenics, but you have all this hallucinogenic symbolism in biogenesis as well. Dr. Sandoz, LSD, the tablets, so on and so forth. I mean, Mulder's actually, he's obviously either having an really bad acid flashback or a bad trip. I mean, that's what that series is about. I mean, that sequence of biogenesis and Sixth Extinction. So it's basically about Mulder's really bad trip. But I looked and I went back to Erlenmeyer Flask. So Erlenmeyer Flask, I think, is the mythology proper. It's the start of the mythology proper, right? I mean, we first get on to the clones and the hybrids and all this kind of thing. And, we first see the gleanings of a syndicate and so on and so forth. But what's the episode that directly precedes that? The episode before that is Roland, about that janitor who's mind controlled by his dead brother. So I'm just like, wait a minute. Is this the entire series? And this pattern occurs throughout the entire series. But then when I went back to the pilot, and the first episode, so the pilot is basically about mind-controlled kids in a psychiatric hospital. That's basically what that episode is about. I mean, we don't know that aliens are doing this. We only know that the forest is calling them. They're being called out to the forest. And the only proof of this is that we have, Scully saved the implant, but we later learn that the implants are being manufactured in the Pentagon. So I'm like, oh, wait a second here. And then the very next episode is Deep Throat, which is also about, mind control, military mind control, pilots being mind controlled, having their memories erased. And there are a couple interesting there are always these little tells, and I'm wondering if they're tells or the coincidences, but in the context of this pattern that repeats throughout the whole series, I'm starting to wonder if they are tells. Because at the end of Deep Throat, when he's Mulder and Deep Throat are in the football field, and Mulder's talking about how his memory's erased, he's wearing a Georgetown shirt. Now, what's the significance of Georgetown? He didn't attend Georgetown, at least as far as we know in his bio, right? Yeah. Well, Georgetown is where the CIA were developing amnesia drugs. You see the connotation there? So it's just is that Chris? I mean, because I just know how weird Chris Carter is, how fractal he is, how strange his mind works, makes all these strange connections. Is that what he's doing there? And then the fact that they go to Vancouver, to film the the pilot episode, and they do it in a hospital in Vancouver. Well, what's the significance of that? Well, there was a hospital in Vancouver that was a notorious MK Ultra headquarters. It was called the Hollywood Hospital, and it was just right up the road. I mean, it was right up the coast from Riverside, where the pilot and several other episodes, by the way, usually if they're in a hospital in the X-Files, they're in this Riverside hospital, in the movie and so on and so forth. So it's just this pattern just persists throughout the entire series, and I'm just kind of wondering, what is Chris Carter really trying to say? You know what I mean? Why is he pairing these episodes together? And I think Paper Hearts, in a lot of ways, is part of this process. And one of the reasons being is that, again, these guys are on the internet. They're on Alt Conspiracy, all these sort of Usenet groups at the time. Well, one of the popular memes that was going around on these news groups was that serial killers were all being manufactured by the government for to change laws to be more restrictive, to create this atmosphere of fear. And we see that very same storyline appear in the final 2 episodes of Millennium. The whole storyline there is that the Millennium Group, not the Academy Group, the Millennium Group is basically justifying their own existence by, where did all these serial killers come in this series? Well, they all came because they were being programmed by the Millennium Group to justify their own power. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So it's just like, it's very, very interesting to me. And this is the power, of the X-Files that I think is vastly underappreciated. It's just how much these guys were pulling in from the news, from the internet. I mean, all these sort of sources, and weaving this in a subtext. Not, other shows would probably call attention to themselves, calling out these themes, but the X-Files does not. So I'm really sorry. And also Paper Hearts follows Tunguska and Terma, which is the black oil, and Mulder sort of being infected with the black oil. So it's like there's this pattern again. So it's just like, what is Chris Carter really saying here? You know what I mean? Like, who are these aliens?
Well, let me ask you then, because I think you posted about this on Twitter, and Tony Black, of course, he sort of said you didn't think Carter intended all this, but it's a nice theory or whatever. So, as you say, you'd expect a series that's doing these things to kind of build to some kind of grand reveal. So I know Chris Carter's mind might be a dangerous place to kind of try and put yourself in, but why is he doing all these things then that seem to be speaking, based on what you're saying, to a very specific kind of subset of the audience, people who are au fait with the Usenet groups or the conspiracy memes or whatever? Yeah, why is he doing that specifically in a way that doesn't go on to have this larger significance, at least in a way that's immediately apparent?
Well, first of all, that's arguable, and I'll tell you why in a second. But you said, I mean, Chris Carter's mind is, it's unfathomable. I've been sort of studying this man for better part of 25 years, and I still don't understand his thinking. I call him the Great Sphinx. His mind is very Sphinx-like. But what I believe, the through line from the pilot to My Struggle 4, and we both talked about My Struggle 4, which I love, even if nobody else does. I don't, whatever. I don't care. But there's a direct through line, because the aliens the alien that we see in that boy's grave in the pilot is not an alien. We later find out that he's a hybrid. These Nazi doctors came over and they were developing these hybrid techniques to merge human and alien DNA and so on and so forth. So that's another thing that I think is vastly underappreciated about My Struggle 4, is that it's the culmination of all this drama over the intervening seasons, but it's sort of like, Mulder and Scully's own child is basically the ultimate outcome of this process. Now, again, I'm not even sure if Chris Carter even conscious. I mean, writers do not always consciously acknowledge the themes that they're playing with. So I think in toto that this is my present working theory, is that Carter is looking at things like MK Ultra. MK Ultra sort of, there are other mind control programs, but MK Ultra sort of morphs. It kind of evolves into the remote viewing programs. There's a direct line of lineage from MK Ultra into Stargate and Grill Flame and all these other remote viewing programs into psychics. So what's one of the key elements of Williams' persona is he's a very powerful telepath, right? So that's a very interesting through line. So I'm always starting to wonder, if he's either consciously, which is possible, or unconsciously, which is also possible. I tend to lean towards consciously, just knowing his thinking and just knowing how he likes to just weave in all these subtle hints that maybe only he understands at the time. But I think that, if you look at the real evolution of these programs, and using, psychedelic mushrooms using hallucinogens, which Carter writes about again and again and again. I mean, we see this in, as late as Babylon, right? Which also is paired with the mythology story. So, I mean, Carter claims that this whole apocalyptic scenario in My Struggle 2 was always meant to be a vision. Well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I have no reason to doubt those claims, even if I sort of get the feeling that maybe that's not necessarily true. But it's paired with Babylon, which is all about this acid trip. So there's a very close connection between psychic powers, remote viewing, the CIA, MK Ultra, that what they were really after. And this is an argument that I've always made, is that they weren't after just mind control, because mind control techniques have been known since the Middle Ages at the very least. Mind control is not anything that you need to research. Those techniques have been known for a very long time. I think it reminds me of the alchemists. So the alchemists had this whole agenda that was very, wide-standing and very elaborate, but they got the money from the kings by saying, "Oh, we can turn lead into gold. We can give you all the gold you need." You know what I'm saying? That's how they got funding from the royal houses. I've always felt that MK Ultra was the same way. It's we're going to give you mind control, but that's not really what they're after. Because if you look at a lot of techniques, they were after they were after something much weirder and stranger and more esoteric and darker and more frightening than that. I mean, I think these people were like waging war on reality itself. And if you look at, a lot of the sort of evidence that isn't necessarily attested to directly, but that plays out in the X-Files episodes, psychic children, you know what I mean? Like the super soldiers, going back as far as Eve. Yeah. I think that a lot of these things that people sort of lump into government conspiracies are much more directly connected to these CIA programs, these sort of post-war programs that have to do with hallucinogens, have to do with theories about interdimensional aliens, have to do with, the work that people like Rick Strassman did with DMT. I mean, it gets very, very esoteric, but it all has to do with making contact with these interdimensional entities and so on and so forth, that was the real goal all along, that it wasn't really about mind control and all this kind of stuff. So if you understand that it's taken me a very long time to even just recognize that this stuff exists. But if you understand that this stuff does exist, and this is a body of thought among very powerful and secretive people, and then you plug that into the X-Files all of a sudden becomes an entirely different story. It's not about extraterrestrial biological entities. It's about interdimensional entities that you contact through, psychedelic drugs. I mean, this is something that Fringe really lifted to as well. The whole thing with crossing over, with the flotation tanks. Flotation tanks and hallucinogens comes directly out of MK Ultra, because that's John Lilly, Altered States. You might have seen that movie with William Hurt. Yeah. So there's this whole constellation of high strangeness in high places that I'm almost starting to suspect now that Carter is really after. And maybe a lot of the questions that people have and things that don't make sense and things that don't line up and things that just seem arbitrary, if you plug this sort of, this meta-narrative into, suddenly the series makes a different kind of sense. And it's very unsettling, to be honest with you. I mean, look at how often Mulder or Scully are in the hospital during mythology episodes, or how often, Mulder is somehow incapacitated, he's drugged. I mean, what is the narrative of the X-Files? The narrative of the X-Files is Unusual Suspects, right? And how does that, how does Mulder start this whole quest? Because he's dosed with these mega doses of hallucinogenic drugs, and he sees everything happening around him as the work of aliens. Do you see what I'm getting at? I mean, it's very esoteric, it's very deep, it's very weird, but all of a sudden I'm starting to see it's making a very disturbing kind of sense. And I think that this episode in particular that we're talking about ties directly into it, because, there's the mythology in the conspiracy underground about serial killers being manufactured. There's, the connections with these programs, mind control and eugenics programs that obviously Samantha is part of, and eventually we see that both Mulder and Scully are part of. It's like, is Carter this? Is he this strange? You know what I mean? Does his mind work? Does his mind work in like this 12th dimensional chess way that you think he's writing about something, but he's actually writing like this entire counter narrative that most people don't even perceive. And to be honest, I mean, I've only seen, perceived glimmers of, as obsessive as I am over these years. Yeah. So, and ironically, I mean, the bizarre thing about it is like El Mundo Giro, an episode that most people just think is just utter trash, is really what sort of put the final piece in place for me. Because it's like, oh God, yeah, these funguses, because all hallucinogens, or at least, the ones we know about, are all based in derivatives from fungus. Do you see what I'm saying? And this is Excelsius DA. This is the entire series. I mean, Field Trip. You just go throughout the series. So what is Carter really trying to say? Is he trying to say something much stranger than anybody even dared imagine? And is this episode in particular one of the linchpins of that? I mean, how much does Gilligan know about this? Because again, this whole mythology that we're talking about with Demeter and Persephone and Isis and Osiris and Cybele and Attis. I mean, all these sort of variations on this whole journey to the underworld motif. Have all been by ethnobotanists and historians have all very definitively tied in this entire mythology that the X-Files sort of springs from to hallucinogenic drugs. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's just like, what is going on here? Hallucinogenic drugs being like the gateway to other realities. So, I mean, is the black oil just like some sort of hallucinogenic compound? In reality, is it not really like some alien virus? Or is, these hallucinogenic funguses, is that what the alien virus is? There's so many possibilities here. Your head starts to spin. And again, this might sound like complete, just nonsense to people. But if you understand the thinking here and how many millions upon millions upon millions of dollars have been spent by the government, looking into these things, government and other entities, by the way, you really start to wonder, what was he up to and who put him onto this? You know what I'm saying? It's so bizarre. Yeah. It really is. It's just insanely bizarre.
Yeah, no, well, I think there's a Secret Sun blog post or six in this.
I don't know, man. It's almost, I can't even begin to wrap my head around it because it's too huge. But it's just like, if you understand the milieu that so many of these stories in the X-Files directly spring from, if you understand where this stuff comes from, and then you start to, wait, why is... And let's just, use shorthand, just say, why is there always an MK Ultra connection to an alien mythology story? Always. You know what I mean? Why are these stories always paired in the sequence, together? Like, what is Carter trying to say? Biogenesis Field Trip is a great example, but it's, again, Paper Hearts and Tunguska and Terma. I mean, what is he saying? Why was the running order of Paper Hearts changed so it would come after Tunguska and Terma? Do you see what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, I can't claim to have any of the answers, Chris, at this point, but...
I don't know if anybody can. I don't even know if Chris Carter himself can, you know what I mean? But it's just like, all of a sudden, I'm telling you something, just because of that terrible, stupid episode about, fungus chupacabras, the entire series is has opened up to me, you know what I mean? And it's just you see it. Look at, Skinner's, and this is another thing I posted about. You can tie all the major characters into this narrative because what did we see in, what's Skinner's origin story? Skinner's origin story is Kitten, which is all about what? Military hallucinogens and mind control. Do you see what I'm getting at here? I mean, when you start to plug this stuff in. I don't want to say it I guess the most obvious example I could think of is They Live, and Rodney Piper puts on the glasses and he suddenly sees all these billboards are saying this entirely different message than what you think they're saying. I mean, that's a bit of a sort of a lunky and inexact allegory here, but if you start plugging all this stuff into the X-Files, it's just what are they saying? What is the show really about? Does anybody really know what this is about? And it just totally changes the entire complexion of the series.
Well, on that note, I think We should probably do another one of these deep background episodes, Chris, shouldn't we? Maybe not for El Mundo Gira, but before too long anyway. But yeah, I think we'll leave it there for today. But yeah, people can check out Secret Sun, can't they, if they want to? I mean, you always a good chance you'll be popping up with an X-Files post on there, isn't there, I think?
Yeah, I'll probably use the blog to sort of try and sort through these stories here because I know we've got Christmas Carol and Emily coming up for the next season. Which of course what follows those episodes, Katsunagari, which is what mind control. You know what I mean? So it's just like, what is going on with these people? So yeah, I am just like. I just feel like somebody just dropped me into the ocean, because I have no idea where I am right now. Like a series that I've spent like 25 years obsessing about that I thought I understood, and all of a sudden it's like, no, you didn't understand anything. So I don't know, man. But it's great that we could sort of touch upon this theorizing in this episode, because I think this episode is very crucial in the development of this, or at least sort of the unveiling of this. So there you go. Great episode. 10,000 plus, on a scale of 1 to 10. You're not an X-Files fan if you don't love this episode. I'm just going to come out and say it.
Yeah, great episode, absolutely. Thanks for your time, Chris. That's it for today, listeners, but until next time, trust no one.
The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.